There we go. Okay. So thank you all for being here, and especially our guest Debbie New. And I'm looking at our agenda, and I want to suggest we save for later in this meeting the citizen comments and concerns and our approval of the minutes from our last meeting and our approval of this agenda. And just go ahead and dive right into Debbie's presentation on thermal energy networks. Hi, Jared.
Hi, Jared. Join us.
Hello, Allison. All right, and Debbie, I know that a you have a presentation to share with us, and I'm going to demonstrate my vast. I want to make you a co-host. Yeah. So, and I think that allows you to share.
Yeah, I think I can. Hang on a second.
A bunch of middle-aged people on technology. What could possibly go wrong? There we go.
Hey,
Nice.
good. Okay, I'm gonna put my slides in slideshow mode. Make sure you can see them. Is that good?
Yep, that's great.
Okay, great. So I have to apologize for my voice. I've been talking about thermal energy networks so much that my vocal cords are rebelling a bit, but I'll do the best I can. So I'm really glad to be here to talk with you about thermal energy networks, specifically what this could look like in Vermont. And essentially, it's a conversation about sharing heat in our communities. So let's see if I can advance the slides. Okay. So I am a coordinator of the Vermont Community Thermal Networks, and we've been going for about 2 years now, essentially in order to put this idea of sharing heat through thermal energy networks on the table in Vermont. This is taking off in so many other places. It's been in practice in Europe for a long time. And we can talk about some other examples of what this looks like. But essentially, VCTN is an umbrella in Vermont for education and organizing and advancing this idea. We're trying to bring in the expertise that we need, get the expertise that we already have in our state, and engage communities in this and coordinate and see what we can do in terms of getting some projects going. And I also want to introduce Jared Rodriguez, who is working closely with me. Jared is Executive Director of Community Decarbonization Partners. Jared, do you want to unmute or whatever briefly and say
Sure.
hello?
Yeah, so I first met Debbie when she told me about this idea for a thermal energy network bill in Vermont. She could probably speak a little bit more about that later, but I thought it was, really innovative. I had been involved a bunch with what was happening in New York and Massachusetts, a little bit in New Jersey as well. But this idea is kind of spreading across the country. And Vermont is sort of out front, like a little bit on the forefront of it because of the work that Debbie's doing, which is pretty exciting. So Debbie kind of brought me in here to be a technical advisor, kind of support some of the work that's happening and help run workshops. We've been doing workshops over the past couple days throughout Vermont, and it's been great. So yeah, I'll turn it back to Debbie.
Great, and Jared is going to be able to answer technical and other kinds of questions like how we might own and operate these, how we might finance them in Vermont. And I just want to say that I grew up in the Burlington area and I now live in South Burlington, but I lived in Waitsfield for 17 years. And one of our favorite things was to go over the mountain to Bristol. And I still like coming to Bristol. And I want to thank Sally and Richard for their help and support on thermal energy network stuff, and also Jim Dumont in Bristol for his work on our bill, which I'll talk about more later. We also have some important state and regional partners, and you can see from this list that Efficiency Vermont is part of it, and energy committees like yours in the VCAN network are a big part of advancing this idea with us. We've got financing partners at the Bond Bank and VITA, and regional planning commissions, as well as regional economic development corporations like Addison County Economic Development Corporations are really important partners in helping us do this. So what I'd like to do this evening is talk through the basics of moving heat, how we can do that with ground source heat pumps, the benefits, and what we mean when we say thermal energy networks. We can talk a little bit about what's happening in Vermont, how this is already working here, and how people are working to develop more of these systems. And then, of course, what's needed in terms of financing and policy. And then the main point is to get to a discussion of what this might look like in Bristol and also what it could do for Bristol. So I look forward to getting to that part of the conversation. And I'm sure I don't need to tell you that in Vermont especially, heat is a precious resource. We spend a lot of time, energy, and money trying to make heat, move heat, and save as much heat as we can. We're using a lot of fossil fuels in order to create our heat. We're having to rely on that a lot, which means we're spending a lot, we're importing that fuel, and that means that our energy dollars are going out of our communities and out of our state. But there is a way to maximize heat that we already have here. And the way we do that is with ground source heat pumps. So you may already be familiar with an air source heat pump. You may already know about a ground source heat pump that sometimes also is called a water source heat pump. These are much like air source heat pumps in that they compress temperature or reject temperature in order to heat and cool inside spaces. But ground source heat pumps use water instead of air, and they also use more moderate temperatures, and that's important in a couple ways that we'll get into. So if you have a ground source heat pump in your home, for example, you can see the gray box in the basement is the heat pump. It looks a lot like a boiler. And that heat pump pulls temperature in from outside the building, compresses it, and delivers it through ducts or some other form through the building to make you warm in the winter. And also can remove the cool and get that out of the building to keep you more comfortable. In the summer, the process reverses. So the heat pump removes heat from the building, sending it outside into the ground, and that allows the space inside to become cooler, and it brings in that coolness to keep you comfortable. Now, this energy comes mainly from the ground, and in this case, it comes from underground, and a lot of people refer to this as geothermal heating and cooling. Which doesn't mean it's about the hot rocks and what you find in Iceland or geysers or that kind of thing coming up from the Earth's core. This is about the energy of the sun being absorbed by the Earth that holds it, and that acts like a solar battery. So we can drill into the Earth and create a borehole like this with vertical pipes filled with water at about the depth of a water well, where the Earth's temperature in Vermont is pretty much a constant 50 degrees, and that's the more moderate temperature that I was talking about earlier. So that's how the energy gets into the house through the vertical pipe, horizontal pipe to the ground source heat pump. So this system works really well for an individual, a home, or a municipal building, a larger building, particularly because they are so low maintenance and efficient. So they can actually lower costs for energy use in our municipal buildings and other large individual buildings. They also work really well when they're networked together. So the important thing here is that we can start small by just linking a couple of buildings and then expand it over time across a neighborhood, across our community to reach different buildings and become a network. And this makes the system even more efficient because buildings need to have different heating and cooling needs at different times. So instead of just wasting that energy, we can share it and balance it between buildings. I just want to talk through some of the benefits of these systems pretty quickly. And I bet you can guess at many of them. For me, one of the important ones is that it's safe and clean because it's mainly water inside the pipes instead of fossil fuels, which means there's no risk of explosions or toxic leaks and no emissions. They're also affordable and reliable because once they're installed, customer bills can be low and predictable year-round. They're also healthy because nothing is burned to create the heat, so indoor air is safer to breathe. They're flexible, which I think is a really important component of these in terms of our Vermont landscape and the local character of our communities. These systems are underground and inside buildings, so they're not visible, they're not an aesthetic problem, and our communities can look exactly the way we want them to. They're also resilient and secure because the pipes are underground and the components are inside. They're less vulnerable to disruption and extreme weather events, particularly in Vermont where flooding is much more of an issue. They can also be equitable because they're not about one house or one building at a time being able to access and afford the system. They're a community scale system that people can tap into, but that is provided across a neighborhood, so it can be available to a lot of people and a lot of buildings at once. They can also be part of a just transition because oil and propane and gas workers are essentially plumbers and pipe fitters, and those are the skills that are needed to install and maintain this equipment. So it would take very little training for our Vermont oil and propane delivery companies to retrain their workers and move into this business instead of going out of business. The other really important thing is that this is local. In other words, the heat is right here. We're using it here. We're investing in our own communities, and we can control these systems locally, whether it's a municipality or a different kind of ownership model. So that's a pretty long list of benefits. So what does this look like? Well, these are a couple different heat pumps. On the left, that's a heat pump unit that is up in the ceiling in a more industrial setting in Burlington at Hula on Lake Champlain. And on the right, a heat pump in an individual building or home looks a lot like a furnace. It's that box. There are also the pipes, plastic pipes of varying diameters, and whether they're narrow or larger, it all goes underground and out of sight. So one place this technology is already working in Vermont is in Burlington at Champlain College. And if you think of a college campus kind of like a community where there are different buildings that serve different purposes, used at different times, you can imagine how a network would be very efficient. At Champlain College, they have new construction where they've installed this. They also have historic buildings that have been retrofit to be dorms and offices that are also using ground source heat pumps. And they've connected the buildings via horizontal pipes underground, kind of like a gas pipe would connect buildings. And those buildings at Champlain College are sharing heating and cooling, and they're working on expanding the system to cover their whole campus. And as I mentioned before, Hula on Lake Champlain is another Burlington example of this technology working. They also have solar and other things that other technologies they've integrated into the system. And so that is working really well, and it hasn't been operating as long as Champlain, but it is still working very well at Hula. There are a lot of other places, and I don't expect you to take in this whole list at once. I can share my slides with you afterwards, but you can see if you scan this, the variety of kinds of buildings, uses. Some are municipal, some are schools, some are businesses, some are farms. And you can see New Haven Town Office down at the bottom of the list on the left. That's pretty near where you are. And there are others coming online all the time. The new Burlington High School will be on geothermal, and I do hear that Bristol is looking at geothermal for one of your schools locally. So we'll talk more about that. Another example I want to share with you is not in Vermont, but we can learn a lot about what's possible by looking at a place like West Union, Iowa. This is a rural community with a population of about 2,700 people. And what that town did is decide that as they were renovating their courthouse, they decided to install ground source heat pumps there. And then because they were doing so much in terms of downtown revitalization, they decided to put in pipes that could reach other buildings. And so this system is designed to reach about 60 buildings, and people can connect to it when they're ready, when they choose to be part of the network and benefit from it. So this is a municipally owned system in a rural community that's been working for a while. So when we talk about thermal energy networks, we're not just talking about energy that's pulled from the ground. We have other sources of heat that we can repurpose. And one of them is wastewater, because if you think about it, you know, we use a lot of water every day, and much of that water we warm up. That water then gets flushed down the drain, and as it leaves our building, it can be about 70 degrees or so. And in some Vermont towns, it goes to a wastewater treatment plant. In other towns, we have town septic. But whether you harness that energy at the treatment plant or you can harness it from a wastewater pipe under a street, you can take that temperature and send it through water and pipes to a ground source heat pump that can use that temperature. You can also reject heat into that water, that wastewater, and it gets carried away so your buildings can be cooled in the summer. So wastewater is one way we can access temperatures that we are already creating and currently discarding. The other way we can access temperature is through waste heat. Now, if you think about a supermarket or an ice arena, and even your refrigerator at home, to cool things down, we have to take heat out of them. So whether it's your refrigerator or a grocery store or an ice arena, in order to provide that refrigeration, heat has to be pulled out of the building. And right now, most of that is being vented through cooling towers or fans you can see on the top of these buildings. It's not just refrigeration, but hospitals, hotels, breweries. There's waste heat coming out of a lot of our big buildings that we can capture and send it back into buildings through water and pipes. So this is what a system might look like, just a concept of what a Vermont town might do. You can see on the left that the supermarket has red arrows showing that the waste heat from the venting fans on top is being put back into the system and used elsewhere. You can also see the lines of wastewater where temperature is being captured and sent out into other buildings. And then under the gazebo in the park, there is a bore field where the town has concentrated the drilling that it needed and put it right underneath that green space, returning the town green to green space, or the same could happen in a parking lot or a recreation field, so that the drilling happens and then the town gets to enjoy the land on top of that as well as the heat underneath it. So thermal energy networks, to sum up, use ground source heat pumps and pipes to connect multiple buildings to provide heating, cooling, and domestic hot water, and also thermal storage, because the system holds heat in the ground and also balances it between buildings at different times. Thermal energy networks also, as I mentioned, harness waste heat from large buildings, refrigeration systems, and from wastewater. So in other words, thermal energy networks use heat that already exists across a community, has already been generated and paid for, and would otherwise be discarded. So I just want to take a minute to talk about the moderate temperatures that ground source heat pumps use and why that matters, why this is an important solution in Vermont. If you think about an air source heat pump, there are times of year when it pulls from the outside air at about 0 or below and has to get to about 70 degrees inside. In the summer, the outside air could be 90 or more, and the heat pump has to work harder to maintain that 70 degrees inside. So an air source heat pump uses more electricity and has to work harder to provide that heating and cooling. Whereas with a ground source heat pump, as I mentioned, the ground underneath is a moderate and constant temperature, so about 50 degrees year round in Vermont, but also waste heat and temperature from wastewater could be about 70 degrees or more. So those more moderate constant temperatures mean ground source heat pumps use less electricity and don't have to work as hard, which means the components are longer lasting, customer electric bills are lower, and we don't need as much electric grid infrastructure. So less investment in wires and poles, but we're finding heat in other places and adding another way to heat and cool our building rather than just through electricity. So importantly, thermal energy networks are a yes and solution. And by that, I mean, that we do need air source heat pumps in most of our Vermont buildings, many of them, and we need to implement those house by house solutions as quickly as possible. And the and part of it is to add community scale solutions like ground source heat pumps where they're most cost effective. So in our town centers where there's density already and we need to add more density because we need to add housing, or we're adding a water or a wastewater or expanding a system like that, or doing other things that are working to meet our community goals, this kind of project can fit in right alongside and even benefit those goals. So I have another example for you that demonstrates the possibility of energy and cost savings over time. So Colorado Mesa University has a system, much like Champlain Colleges, that's been operating for about the same amount of time. And there's a bunch of statistics on this slide for the people who really love data. What I want to call your attention to is that they are saving $1.5 million in energy costs per year. Now, this is a large system at a campus serving about 16 buildings now, but they've managed to reduce their tuition by 2%, which is a lot, and it really matters to their students and their enrollment. And in terms of maintenance over that time, they've replaced some pump bearings, and that's about it. Another system we can learn from is in Vancouver, which is far away from Vermont, but it's something we can learn from because this is a municipally owned system that recovers heat from a wastewater treatment plant and provides, as you can see on the right-hand side, about 70% of the heating and cooling in this neighborhood. So this municipally owned system provides an return on the investment to the taxpayers and affordable rates to its customers. So there are a couple things we need to do in Vermont in order to make thermal energy networks possible. And one is to figure out how we're going to finance them. There are a lot of opportunities, unprecedented opportunities, particularly from the federal government in the form of the Inflation Reduction Act and also other programs. But the IRA in particular lets us start at 30% off of these systems, 30% tax incentives. And if you're a municipality or a nonprofit, you can receive that money directly as a check from the IRS, but it's also very beneficial to businesses and others. So that can go a long way toward making the upfront cost affordable for us. The other opportunities are in our state and locally. We can optimize the utility model. In other words, we can set up a thermal energy utility locally or regionally to allow us to access the upfront capital and then recover those costs over a longer period of time through rates to customers. So that makes it affordable to customers and it makes it doable in terms of affording the cost of installing the infrastructure in the first place. The utility model is very familiar to municipalities that operate water and wastewater systems. We can also engage businesses because businesses have a lot of heat they're generating and wasting, and they also have a lot of heating and cooling needs. So this matters to them. So public-private partnerships are an important vehicle, and our local banking community is another place we can turn to for support of these community scale projects. And we can leverage other kinds of federal funding. The Vermont Bond Bank and VITA and our state treasurer are all working hard on pulling down those federal dollars and figuring out how they're going to be distributed across the state. The other thing we need is a policy shift. We have a bill at the State House that is moving forward, and you can see the bill numbers that we've been using, and then you can see the green box that says S305. So the Thermal Energy Network Act was those numbers and is now an amendment to S305, which is a larger bill. But essentially, what this does, it authorizes municipalities to set up thermal energy utilities, and it also allows cooperatives to do this or businesses. But in particular, it allows municipalities to go ahead and do this because they're already locally regulated because of local government, and they already operate shared infrastructure like water and wastewater systems, which are moving water through pipes. And with a thermal energy network, we're moving heat through water, through pipes. So it's really pretty much the same thing. So this gives statewide authorization for municipalities to implement the solution, regardless of what their town charter says. So I like to think about it as a green light for us in Vermont to go ahead and do this through S305. And we're hoping that by the end of the session, it will pass and we'll be good to go. So I want to return to where we started, which is the obvious thing that heat is a precious resource, but also that we have the heat we need and we have opportunities to harness it. So I made a couple screenshots of Bristol so we could talk about that, but I think for now I'm going to stop sharing and I would love to hear what your questions are, what you think about this, and then we could talk specifics about what's already happening in Bristol and how this might fit in with what you're doing, and how we might do that together.
Debbie, that was really informative. Thank you for that. You talked about the vertical wells. Do you see, I've heard of trenches, 5, 6 feet deep, going horizontally. Do you see those as practical for this?
Yes, if we have the open space to install those. So what is being said is that, which I didn't describe in the presentation, is that you can go vertically to access the ground temperature. You can also put coils of pipe, like if you took a slinky and you stretched it out. In fact, these systems are called slinkies, and you can bury that about 6 feet down if you have an open field or something like that. And that is a way to harness the ground temperature. So it doesn't have to be drilled vertical boreholes, just with trenching and pipes underground. You can either do it by the slinky method or you can lay pipes next to each other back and forth underground, and that can work as well, but it depends on your space.
I met with a company that makes heat exchangers in Germany, and they develop sheets out of the same material that the pipes are made of, so polypropylene. And they're like almost like the size of a 3/4 plywood, 4 by 8 feet. And so you could use like a trench digger and just slot those sheets down as well. And the same sheets are usable in a pond or a lake or elsewhere. So, or even as a backer to solar, and you could take the heat off the back of the solar panel because they absorb a lot of heat. So, there really isn't one solution. Drilling 500-foot deep or 1,000-foot deep wells is the most expensive version of this. So, if you have a project that pencils out with that, then there are ways to get the price down and get the cost down by incorporating other less expensive technologies.
So you're muted, but you're now.
Sorry. Okay.
You're good.
I have a question about the network. How far is it practical to extend the network? Like from, let's say, the field of the geothermal to the furthest building, what would that be?
Debbie, could you bring up that map?
Yes, just a second.
Yeah.
And Jared, we have a map of this part of Bristol, but we also have the next one, which is more of the main street.
Right. Yeah,
So
so
you
maybe
can
go
take-
back to the full
Okay.
picture. Right. So I think what's interesting is there's like immediately just by looking at this, there's a couple clusters where this starts to make sense. Based on what Debbie was saying, it doesn't have to happen all at once, right? It could start with an anchor and then start to grow from there, or there could be multiple clusters around town and grow from there and eventually interconnect. So I'm just looking at this and I see, obviously there's the elementary school, right, just above the downtown area. There's the cluster with the Shaws and the downtown. There's the high school and the fields around it. And then there's this area that, you know, it's Vermont Farm Table, Living Well residents, like that over there might be its own cluster. So, you know, these systems can grow organically typically based on where thermal energy resources are. And so what we've done, and actually Sally's on the phone, she was at one of these workshop meetings, is we'll just put pins in a map where we know there are thermal energy resources. For example, the Shaw's is rejecting heat all year. That's a thermal energy resource that you could tap and share heat. And then I'm sure there are other, you know, other thermal energy resources around town, including breweries and any sort of like industrial use or production facility, anywhere where there's refrigeration. And then obviously geothermal and surface water and other things like that. So
Follow-up question, I guess, then. Does it seem that more communities are being successful going the geothermal route or the sort of the heat sharing route, which seems just, I don't know, just my initial thought is that it would be harder to do because first of all, you need a partnership with that grocery store or ice arena. And it seems like the scale of it is not going to be as great as, you know, like a geothermal system that can serve like multiple buildings. Is there?
it's basically, it's the same thing. They're not really different things, because if you are going to do geothermal, right, you still have to have an agreement with whoever owns that land or wherever there is accessible land to access you know, the drilling, to do the drilling and have a bore field. If you think about it, a grocery store connected to a system is like a grocery store being connected to a geothermal system. It's not this, they're not different things. In fact, it's the same heat pumps, right? So really, like, it doesn't matter where the heat comes from. And in fact, if you want a project to be economic, you need to be looking for those free sources of heat first before you do the more expensive source of heat. So, you know, it's that is likely the way to organize and to think about it. You know, I know like Shaw's is owned by a big corporate entity like Albertsons, right? And it might not be easy to get them to come to the table, but sometimes the land that the Shaw's is sitting on is owned by somebody that's local or a developer, right? So like that's a case that we found in Middlebury, for example, and that person might be more accessible than the corporate entity. But then again, a lot of these companies have their own energy and sustainability targets. So they very well might be interested in pursuing something like that. So it's really a mix, and every place is different. So if you can't access Shaw's heat, then it's like, okay, what's the next best thing? Right after that, and then go after that, and then what's the next best thing after that, and then go after that. So it's almost like this project priority approach that you can optimize in a way that drives the upfront cost down.
How do you assess the heat that's coming from a particular business or a building? Like if we wanted to do that with Shaw's, obviously, yeah, as you said, Shaw's is owned by its own corporation. Parmelo, they're based in Vermont. They own the land which the Shaw's is on. How do we see what Shaw's is wasting? How do we see what the school is wasting? What's the process for that?
So there's some rules of thumb around grocery stores, right? So it's almost like, well, how much refrigerated space do they have? What's the size of the grocery store in general, right? Like how many square feet? And you can use rules of thumb to sort of like assess how much heat you think is coming out of it. They're all pretty similar. In fact, like I know someone who, like, Shaw's is their client. They do a lot of lighting and refrigeration work for them. And so it shouldn't be too difficult to figure out how much heat is available from from a store like that. And they're pretty cookie cutter. So like if you know one, you know another one. We're actively figuring out what's coming out of the Shaw's in Middlebury. So I bet it's a very similar store there.
And then what's the process of capturing that? Like
Yeah,
what
right.
infrastructure are you putting in to be able to, like you said, if you're starting with that, if that's what you need to begin with to be able to make the project economical, what's being installed?
Right. So capturing heat from any sort of refrigeration system, there's either like a compressor and an outdoor condenser, like a fan, right? That's having refrigerant move between it. And so there are refrigerant to water heat exchangers. And that's basically what gets cut into the system. There are different manufacturers. LG calls it a hydro kit. You could put a LG hydro kit on like that split system that's behind you folks in the town office. That, on those types of heat pumps, you can connect to a water-based distribution network. If there's a cooling system that uses water, like a cooling tower, right? Which I doubt there is one in Bristol, but maybe there is, I'm not sure. That's easier because then it's just a water to water heat exchanger. So, there's a few different ways of doing it. But generally, yeah, you would cut in a heat exchanger into the refrigerant line.
Okay. And that's an additional piece that attaches or in some way connects to the existing equipment. It doesn't replace the existing equipment.
It doesn't necessarily replace the existing equipment.
Okay.
Yeah. But you got to like look at so how old is the grocery store's equipment? Are they coming up on a capital cycle? If they are and they're going to start replacing stuff, then there might be better options versus cutting a heat exchanger into the existing equipment.
Yeah.
So timing that is also important. And I think Jim had his hand up.
Yes, it's all well and good. I can see individual buildings having their own unit. But now you start tearing up infrastructure. Ian can tell you how expensive it is to repave. Okay, you've got to get right of ways. Sometimes Act 250 comes in. They're trying to put in a simple bus shelter, as Ian will tell you, and they had to go through an Act 250 process. So you're talking about a great expense to do this when it would probably be more equitable for them to each have their own individual units, in my opinion.
It depends, right? It's not a blanket yes or no, right? So it really does depend. If you're crossing some like sensitive environmental area and you can't put pipe in the ground, then you're not doing it, right? But I'll tell you that Shaw's parking lot and that downtown area where you might not even have to go into a public right of way because everything's sort of contiguous, that looks pretty good. Eventually parking lots have to get repaved anyway too. So
Yeah, that brings us to something that Sally and I have talked about projects already happening in Bristol, such as replacing water pipes when streets are open anyway. So that's the kind of thing that is important to think ahead about and think about how these other pipes might be installed at the same time so that you're right, Jim, the paving expense doesn't have to be greater than what it would be anyway.
right.
Sally, do you want to talk about some of the thinking you've been doing about this? I think you've been gathering some
Sure.
information.
Well, I was just thinking about the different things that we have in our town where there's extra heat, that kind of thing. And thinking about the downtown because sometime down the road, we're going to be replacing the pavement anyway. I was thinking about, and this is just, not having talked to any of the business owners or the buildings. It's just sort of thinking and imagining right now is what we're doing. And so the idea of the laundromat as a heat source and a Bobcat restaurant. They do a lot of dishwashing and hot water movement and also beer brewing in there. And then there's Covers across the street, also a restaurant. And then down the street a little bit is the mini factory, and there again, a restaurant, water use. So there's maybe some access to warm water in those three buildings, those three restaurants and one laundromat. And then above, there are apartments or offices in these buildings. Maybe they could use that. So that kind of area is one thought. And then the idea of adding more people as they wanted, like down the road, is Bristol Suites. Those are all rental rooms for rent, and then you know, a few other shops and different places that need heat in general. And so that could be add-ons going down Main Street if it was wise to put something in through the whole Main Street to just have it there for people to hook onto. And then we're talking about, oh, go ahead.
Or behind the buildings, Sally. So
Yeah,
like,
okay,
yeah,
back here,
right.
right behind the buildings. Yeah. Same with the back behind these buildings. It could go back there and then be part of Wild Green Shaw's. That could be a loop if that Prince Lane area parking lot was being redone. Also, Bristol Beverage, they've got a lot of refrigeration over here on Prince Lane. And then there are apartments here, you know, so that's other ways. Also the chocolate place over here, and more offices. So that's one idea, just looking at those different things. And this is just, again, in the dreaming stage. We're just learning about this and thinking about what's possible. Then there's the school that's up this way. There's the, so the school's over here. And then over by the Bristol Works area, you know, they've talked about someone wants to buy one of these buildings. What are they going to do with it? We know they're baking a lot of crackers over here in this building, and that's a lot of heat. So
Which building is that, Sally?
it's
Where are
part
they?
of it's part of the Bristol Works building, and okay,
Vermont
it's
Farm Table.
yes,
That's the area.
right
Yeah.
in here. Yeah.
So it's a collection of buildings with various sort of small scale businesses.
Yep, there's some healing arts in here. There's a big woodworking here. There's a dentist and a medical health center here. This is where the school superintendent office is, as well as some others. But that's the building that someone seems to want to buy, but who knows if that's really going to happen. And then there's well, there's a room for a few more buildings over here that I don't know if anyone's made any plans yet, but those would
Sally,
be new buildings.
Sally, we can't see where you're looking or where you're pointing.
Oh,
but-
I couldn't
but that's
probably
tell. on Firehouse Drive bottom.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
Where
can use
Stony
my
Hill comes
cursor.
up, yeah.
You're talking about-
There you
Okay,
go.
that's great. I've been using
Yeah.
my pointer the whole time thinking you could see it.
We can't see it. We can't.
Most of the time we knew where you were talking. So Firehouse Drive has the town's fire department building, which what isn't on this map is the new business
All
park,
Earth Renewables.
which is being developed. So there's All Earth Renewables. There's a large, I think it's 25,000 square foot building behind where the cursor is right now. There's also new Firehouse Apartments, which are to the right of the Firehouse Drive
Yep.
text. So there's apartment buildings there. And then there are two other building lots behind that are hopefully will be developed in the future by incoming businesses. So there's potential there. The All Earth Renewables is all heat pumps and all solar. And they make products for, I believe it's solar tracking in some way.
Yeah.
So they're definitely supportive of that. But I was going to have a question regarding so you talked about the town, you know, we're already a utility in terms of our water district. The select board are the water commissioners. For something like this, you talked about becoming a new utility for this particular kind of energy. Is it more cost effective for the town to take something like this on and become a utility for this kind of energy production? Or looking at the areas in Bristol, does it make more sense to be, as Jim said, to be sort of individualized, where it's the school maybe having their own system running that, Bristol Works running their own, Stony Hill Business Park running their own.
You could apply the same question to having a water district. So what's the purpose of having a water district versus everyone having their own? It's the same discussion. It's ultimately the exact same discussion. So, and then what kind of activities are done being a water district, right? It's the same activities that would happen in this case. So you're not running the exact same water through it. One is a closed loop and one is an open loop.
Yep.
So the pumping actually on the closed loop, I think are you pumping at all? Are you folks doing any pumping? Okay, so the pumping on the open loop for your potable water, the power consumption is much more than what the pumping would be on a closed loop, which is sort of interesting. So yeah, I mean it's ultimately like extremely similar activity. And the economics, when you compare an individual versus like a collective, the economics start to become pretty clear. I would say, that is one path, like being a municipal utility, you could do it. There are other paths, right? So say there's a group of folks that wants to get together. It could be even homeowners, for example, and they want to start something like an HOA or a cooperative. They can, they can do that. And if in certain locations where you're not accessing a public right of way, they don't even necessarily need to ask for permission. I mean, they'll need a building permit, but they can do their own agreements and right of way agreements between each other, especially if the parcels are contiguous. So it's pretty flexible, like in terms of the technology, right? The thermal energy resources, and the different ways of owning and developing the systems. I think what really matters is getting to the point where the community sort of knows who or what is going to go after it. Because if you can identify that, then it'll happen faster. Versus just, kind of just talking about this. It might not happen if you don't identify the who. Or the collection of organizations or people that want to come together to do something.
How do you scale up with water? We're pumping from the New Haven River. It travels up to our reservoir, our storage tank up above in the mountain here, and then it's distributed down. We know how much flow, how many gallons go through it every single day. It's monitored daily in terms of the things that are in the water. And then if it's new connections that are being created, a new housing development is coming in, we're looking at the connections. We know how to scale it and what the potential connection effect will have on the network itself. So for this kind of network, how do you scale up? How do you add? I guess well, I guess two questions. Is it a centralized place? We know where the water comes from. We have the pump house and we have the tank. Is a thermal energy network a centralized place? And then how do you scale? We just have a new housing development come in. They want to take advantage of this. Is it just piping to it? But then how do you scale that to know that it's going to produce the heat or the cooling that this housing development needs?
So it's central and decentral, right? And it depends where there are thermal energy resources. So the system, again, like the system might not be one system. It could be a collection of multiple across town. When they connect to each other, when multiple loops connect, they don't even physically connect. There's a heat exchanger that goes in between. So it's not all the same fluid that's moving around the town like a potable water system. It's separated systems. It's a lot more like electricity than it is like potable water, actually, if you think about it. So what's electricity? You're like trying to keep pressure up or voltage. And you're doing that. There's some people taking out and there's some generators putting in, and you're trying to keep that balanced. Electricity is instantaneous, so it's harder to do. Thermal energy has some lag, so it's easier to do. So, for example, if you wanted to add a new multifamily onto an existing network, say there was a network in the downtown and a new multifamily was going to come online, you could achieve that additional capacity by either maybe drilling another borehole, adding solar thermal to it, right? Or adding storage to create that thermal lag, more of a thermal lag, if that makes sense. So like matching up the heat use versus the heat sort of production, we'll call it, is much like how an electric system will work, or how you're kind of like balancing even gas. I mean, gas is kind of similar. It's the same fluid moving through the system, but you're like balancing pressure and you're doing regulator valves. And sometimes you have to bring in another pipeline to give enough pressure into a system. So very similar to that. Yeah.
I just want to interject that as we talk with Vermont towns, or if anyone is living in Vermont, you are probably aware that Vermont municipalities are at capacity, if not beyond capacity. And so we are definitely addressing how this could happen in municipalities when municipalities are already overloaded and doing everything they possibly can to keep up with the community needs. So that's why we're looking at other ways to own and operate this, particularly third parties, companies that can do the installation and the ownership of it, but then be able to transfer ownership to the town at some point in the future when the system is de-risked and people see that it's working and that, oh, it is a lot like our water department. We could save money by taking that over ourselves. So we're also looking at setting up thermal co-ops that could do this. I know that Bristol has experience with Acorn Energy Co-op, and there's some conversation over there about what their role might be in supporting municipalities in doing this. So I wouldn't want people to misunderstand that we're expecting Vermont towns are just going to start doing this. There's going to need to be quite a bit of support, and that's one thing that we're working on building across the state.
You know, if there's no political will or support in any particular community, then they're not going to do this, right? There's a process to build it and create it. And like we've started that process in some other towns. What's interesting is I think when you're looking at it from like an economic development perspective, some communities that we're speaking to like kind of immediately grasp it. Like, oh, you're putting in the shared infrastructure. It makes a particular location more attractive because you have lower heating costs. You know, that means that a developer is going to want to come in and potentially build housing. And when they build housing and they're connected to a system like this, the cost of their building is lower. In some cases, it's 30% lower because you're pulling the needed systems to heat the building out of the building in some cases. And so, you know, there's a municipal project in a town north of yours where they're taking an old armory building and they're renovating it. And they want to put municipal services into it, and they're bond constrained. They don't have full funding for the project, but they've started the project. And they're needing to go to the taxpayers again and ask for another bond. And so to reduce the cost of that project, they're saying, well, maybe we could carve out the mechanicals and the geo and have that be under a third-party entity. And it won't be part of the underwriting for the project. So that's happening. Things like that are happening as well. Yeah. Another good one, I don't know if there are any like telecom buildings in the community or data center or anything like that, but that's also a pretty big heat resource. We were looking at White River Junction and we realized, oh, there was like a pretty big telecom building right in the center of town. I think Richard's got his hand up.
Yeah, I do. In your experience, either Debbie or Jared, who are the movers and shakers in getting these things started? And what might be their vested interest? Is it pure community love for their community, or are there other models? I'm just curious of how a project like this would get started in Bristol.
Yeah, Debbie, do you want to
I can go
take?
first, sure,
Yeah.
and then you can add. So in my experience, the initial interest is coming from a lot of energy committees like yours. And that's where the conversation starts, but it's not always the case. So as Jared mentioned, in the town north of yours, it's the assistant town manager, who is also the economic development director for the town, that is really driving this. In another place, it is the industrial park people who want to attract new businesses and make it really welcoming for having clean energy available. And in other places, regional planning commissioners are aware of towns that have projects that need this kind of support to make the shared infrastructure help benefit the building of a new school or that kind of thing that's next to an ice arena and could use that heat. So it really, it's happening in lots of different ways in different places. And Jared, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, so I mean, it depends who's in the community, right? So if there's a group of folks in the community that want to pursue it, then they can. If there's a group of business owners that wants to pursue it, they can. There's like different models for doing it. You know, the gas utility, right, in the western part of the state is interested in starting to pursue this. So is that right? In some communities, it's not right. They don't want that. So, you know, asking if a third party was going to come into the town and pitch something like this, asking them where their money's coming from, I think is really important. Asking them what their vested interests are is really important. There's a difference between something that's like municipal wide, like larger scale across public rights of way, and something serving just private businesses. Right? Because if a group of private business wants to do this on their own and they work with their own third party, or they pool their money and they do it and they borrow and they have their own system, the municipality isn't really going to be involved with that too much, except for maybe offering a building permit or something. So, you know, it really depends. It depends on what the system is, where it is, what property it's going on, who wants to be involved, who doesn't want to be involved. It's a bunch of different pathways. So what we've done is we've had these workshops with a pretty diverse set of stakeholders in different communities. We start asking these questions and we put maps out and people start to determine what a system might look like or what a different ownership model might look like in a particular neighborhood. And communities like are capable of answering those questions themselves, which is pretty interesting. Yeah. So West Union, Iowa, I mean, that's like a really good one. That is an economic development driven type of project where they said, you know, we need to revitalize our downtown and be more attractive. So we're gonna build this system and sell heat at deeply discounted rates to make business more competitive. You know, that's possible. So pretty interesting. I don't know. It's a really good example of people taking things into their own hands. I see a lot of this happening in places where people are enthralled with the gas utility or even the electric utility. So there's a lot of this, like we can support ourselves and advance our own work and not be reliant so much on much larger companies or systems.
Debbie, I
So
wasn't sure, Deb,
no, go ahead.
I was going to say, I don't know if it was in your slides. What was is there a return rate in terms of systems like this? Like 10-year, 20-year? What is that return rate?
It depends, as many things do with this. Jared,
Right.
do you want to field that question?
Well, the question is what's acceptable first. What return do you want to achieve, right? And then you define your project based on that, right? So I don't know. I've spoken to, there's an infrastructure fund in the Netherlands, right? And they get their money from a pension fund, retirement money from public employees. And the pension fund is saying we'll only accept that money going into renewable energy projects. And because of that, they'll accept a 5% return, which is like really low. I mean, that's extremely low. Most lenders or investors in this, they want something more like 12 to 15%, right? So what can a geothermal system yield? After all the incentives and tax credits, I mean, there are projects that have a 5-year return and there's projects that have a 12-year return. It really depends. I mean, you all there are on fuel oil and LPG, right? Like that's
Right.
what's heating everybody. So your returns are gonna be higher because it's not natural gas. You're not competing with those low natural gas rates. So that's the difference in a place like Bristol. The hurdle to get something like this done and make it attractive economically is lower because there's no gas system.
And
Yeah.
Ian, the slide, I looked back at it, it's Colorado Mesa University that said it was less than 10-year return on investment
Okay.
campus system.
That's a big system.
Yeah.
That was a really big campus system, yeah.
Richard, did
and-
you have a
and
question?
in-
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Richard.
Well, I was just going to ask, so a starting point for Bristol might be um, maybe to define some, almost to have a large meeting and ask interested building owners to come and look at the map and begin to define some areas and then see if there's interest in pursuing this. I mean, is that a starting point?
That is one way you could go, and that's what we've just done this week in 3 other Vermont towns, is to have a local meeting, essentially a workshop, that we work with local people to design the way you want it to go. And you would do the inviting, getting the people in the room that you feel need to be there. And we do look at big maps. We talk about where heat might be found locally, and then we actually look at a map of the community and we identify groups of buildings or clusters that are potential, that could possibly be a node or part of a network. And we talk about how that might be organized. And the way it's happening in Vermont is that people are doing initial community meetings where people learn and they explore the idea, kind of like what we're talking about here tonight, but with more people in the room in person. And then we would have a follow-up workshop where we really get into details to define a project more and really think about who's going to do it, how's it going to happen, what do those choices mean in terms of how it can get financed. So we've been doing this 2-part workshop format, and that would be something that we'd be very happy to work with people in Bristol to design and do it the way you would want it to happen.
Yeah, there really is no one way to do it. And it really is or should be self-determined, to be honest. Yeah.
Has there been any look at environmental impact? Because you just think of other resources that we once thought were limitless, and come to find out they're not. So systems that have been in place for a decade or so. Any studies on environmental impact, fisheries, things like that, as we heat up groundwater, lower the temperature of groundwater, et cetera?
Yeah, so in Vermont, it's the other issue. It's the opposite. It's do you cool it down too much?
Hmm.
Right. And if there's not enough capacity to draw from, you'll pull the heat out of that resource so much that it will freeze.
But Jared, do you know about environmental impacts that have been studied or demonstrated on this stuff?
Yeah, so on the cooling side, you really shouldn't be rejecting heat into waterways, for example. You know, we do that all the time with power generation, and it's a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like, you know, the Hudson River is a good example where if there's like an early heat wave in the spring and the power plants are running and there's heat being dumped into the river, they'll get an anoxic event and all the fish will die. It's like pretty bad. So, you know, rejecting heat into bodies of water probably is not a great idea. Yeah, but extracting heat out of might be in some cases a good idea because we're dealing with too much heat in the environment in general. So the other potential impact is if the system has glycol in it, which is a food grade alcohol, and there's a leak, you know, it can have environmental impacts. So if there was a leak and it goes into, for example, a waterway, there can be environmental impacts.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
I guess the other one is just heat pumps in general, right? Any refrigerant, if it leaks, there's some pretty serious environmental impacts. So there are heat pumps that are starting to use less toxic and, you know, less having less of an atmospheric impact. And they're using CO2, which is pretty interesting. Yeah.
I wonder if there are more questions or if maybe we could have another minute or two for people's thoughts and responses to this, whether it's in terms of Bristol or what you heard that you're curious about or you're excited about, or just wondering how this is landing with you, what you're thinking about, what we're sharing and what we're talking about.
I'll go fill the space. I can certainly see, I mean, in my mind, I live just down the street from the business district. I'm a block away. And certainly those buildings and Shaw's and the Beverage Center and the Town Hall would make a terrific cluster if everybody in that cluster were willing to sign on and funding and so on were available. I mean, it would seem to me that there'd be real promise there. When we try to get the schools engaged, there may be a lower return. Certainly, it couldn't be connected. I wouldn't think wouldn't be feasible to connect to the downtown cluster because of distance. So they would have to make them part of a system. They would have to be kind of standalone, and you'd have to see if that's going to pay out. I visited years ago a school in upstate New York, right along Lake Ontario, an elementary school, where they installed a phenomenal system that included a community natatorium and moved from an oil burner system, big boiler room, to a little furnace, backup furnace that they never had to turn on because they were so good at reclaiming heat from the refrigerators and things like that in the building. Doubled their floor space and went from heating only the four-season conditioning, used the pool as a storage medium.
Yeah.
I mean, it was everything you could think of.
Yeah. Yeah.
And their energy cost dropped precipitously And I visited it with my students on a 5-degree day. And they said they had never started the backup furnace. We went down to the boiler room. Here's this big room and this little furnace sitting there. And they buried the wells under the soccer field. And this was easily 15 years ago. And it was highly successful. So I know if if the high school wanted to engage in this kind of thing as its wood heating system ages out, I mean, it could very definitely, I think, pay out.
You know, what's interesting is the existing equipment, like it can sit there as a backup if you've got room in the boiler room. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's important to have backup
Oh, yeah.
just in case. So yeah, I mean the pool, like as you described, having the pool, that adds that thermal storage, right? And it adds that lag that you're looking for. You know, in Middlebury, there's a pool right next to an ice arena. And I suspect that the pool's not being heated by the ice arena. But there's you know, we had a meeting up in a brewery, right? And they're taking their heat off their refrigerant line because they, you know, after they brew, everything's hot and they're cooling it down. They have to keep the vats refrigerated because the bacteria, like the yeasts, will create so much heat that they'll kill themselves. So they're creating their own heat as they you know, process the sugars, and they're cooling that and taking that heat off. They are using the heat in their facility. So they are doing that recovery, that heat recovery, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think Jim's got his hand up.
Again, you're talking about a school system. Who pays for the school system? The taxpayers. So who's gonna bear the brunt of that whole installation? Us. And we're tapped out in Bristol right now.
Yeah.
The other situation you talked about, a water district as opposed to this new district. Our water district is in place. You'd have to create a new district, which means infrastructure. It's a lot of money. Bristol cannot afford that type of thing. Individual units at different buildings, fine, that's great. If I could afford it, I'd do it here at my own home. But it's very expensive, and the people of Bristol are tapped out tax-wise. We just voted down our school budget twice. I mean, that's got to tell you something. I mean, it's all great ideas, but it's like a dream, really. You can't afford it. We cannot afford it.
I think it's got to be shown to be economically feasible with a good payout.
Yeah.
I
Reasonable.
think that's the thing. If we're talking about 10 years, it doesn't make sense. But if we're talking about 30 years, all of a sudden we've started saving money. So it's kind of a long-term thing to think about.
I think the other thing to know is that no place is static. So you don't spend money on a place and then it just sits there forever. You always have to spend money on it to keep it going. So how are you spending your money right now, and how could you change that just a little bit and maybe not spend more money? Maybe spend the same amount and get a different outcome. So I think that's kind of the way to think about it sometimes. No city is just sitting there. It's deteriorating. We're all deteriorating. You got to keep it going. So
I have to mention that.
yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry. After these workshops, I feel it. I mean, Debbie's voice is just completely shot. I can't believe it. Sorry, Debbie.
I'm doing
Uh,
okay.
Yeah.
Does it seem feasible, let's say, thinking out loud here, put a system in the elementary school and offer up to contiguous households to hook into that system as well? Is that a possibility?
Yeah. Yeah. If, you know, if it makes sense for the elementary school.
Mhm.
But once something is in, the marginal cost of connecting to it is pretty low. So that's why usually when these get built out, they're serving like anchors,
Mhm.
you know? So kind of like a strip mall, right? There's like the anchor, which is the grocery store, and then there's little stores next to it, right? It's kind of like that. And so if you've got an anchor and then you have homeowners in between, the cost of them connecting to it is relatively small.
Got it. All right, last call. on
Sally wants to
comments.
say that. Just say it,
Sally,
Sally.
hit it.
Okay. I just didn't want to keep it going on and on if we were just doing last words earlier. The idea of if you're going to hook on with other people down the road, do you need to have something in the road to do that? So if you're doing houses, do you wish you had put the pipe in the road when it was paved? Because that's a big thing in Bristol. We have a lot of repaving to do. And if we could put something in the roads when it was being paved, that would be the time to do it, it seems.
Yeah, so utilities do this a bunch, and so they'll drop extra conduit in, right? They'll put extra pipe in sometimes, because it's not the cost of the pipe. Like the
Mhm.
cost of the pipe per linear foot is really tiny compared to the cost of the whole job. It's
Yeah.
really like it's the digging and the excavating and then the
Yeah.
pipe fitters connecting the pipes and that sort of thing. So if a street is opening up anyway, then yeah, I mean you could leave pipe down there and cap it, even if it's not in use. It wouldn't necessarily increase the cost of the project dramatically. And so we're having conversations with folks that are starting to do that, right? Like there's a town much further south of you that is putting in a new water system, like new, and they're thinking about this. Like if we're trenching and everything's wide open, like why don't we drop an extra pipe in or two? Which kind of makes sense in some ways, yeah.
Mhm.
Well, I wonder if this is a good place to leave the conversation for now. I think you have other things on your agenda. And I just want to commend you for the work you're doing on MERP, because I know that is a big job and it's really important. I hope you're getting good reports back on how you might be able to leverage MERP funds locally, and also the geothermal possibility for the school. So Jared and or I would be very happy to talk with you some more if you'd like to pursue the idea of a workshop to get more other people in the room and to look at this more closely. That would be great. So I'll trust you'll let me know what else we could do and what other questions or thoughts come up. I always learn a ton when I am talking with people in Vermont towns about what's possible, what's realistic, and what works for them. So I just want to say thank you for inviting us both here. It's great to talk with you.
All right,
Thank
thank
you
you,
for
Debbie and
coming.
Jared.
Great.
Yeah, very informative.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Have a good evening. Look forward to
You
hearing
too.
from you. Bye.
Take care. Have a good
Thanks
night.
so much.
Bye-bye.
See you, Sally.
Bye-bye,
Bye.
Jared. Bye, Debbie.
All right. That's great. Boy, I don't know about anybody else. My head is full.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I want to humbly suggest that we consider how time sensitive is the MERP information that we have on the agenda?
that's really not because we don't have the full information yet. I think, Ian, you said they thought a couple of weeks we'd have
Yeah.
the full Monty.
Yeah, so I asked for the draft of it because we were meeting last week to look at the library and just see what the potential is there for systems. And so they gave me the draft, and it doesn't have everything it needs, obviously, in that.
Yeah.
I can if you move the MERP discussion to I think when they're all done, I think that's going to better serve you.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But I'm happy to give an update of what we discussed at the library. That was Val and myself, Frida, who's the grant administrator for Bristol Town, as well as Dave Whitcomb from Champlain Valley Plumbing and Heating. If you are interested in hearing that, I can give you 10 minutes on that.
Sure.
I'd like to hear that.
So, Dave's experienced. He's been around a long time. He put the geothermal system in my house and my air transfer system. So he knows what he's talking about. Looking at the space, he felt that in terms of air exchange, it's a difficult proposition with what's there, especially because any ductwork you'd have to put in, it would need to be visible. And so that means in the upstairs space, it's not a lot of space area where you can put that where it's going to look good. In the downstairs space, there isn't enough in between joists because of the in-floor heating system. So he felt that you would probably have to have visible ductwork if you wanted to do an all air exchange system, and that would be an ERV, an energy recovery ventilator, which transfers lost heat that's leaving the building into the new air coming into the building. I have in my house here, because it was a super insulated house when it was built with spray foam, I have an HRV, a heat recovery ventilator, but they're very similar. And I guess they use ERVs now more than HRVs. The town has an HRV as well in the downstairs offices. So he felt ductwork would be difficult. He did suggest a system that maybe is not as wouldn't require as much ductwork to be put in, and you could have it in a couple of places that could bring fresh air in and have an exchange of air going out. It maybe wouldn't be as efficient, but it would allow you to sort of have the system be hidden and have minimal grill work put into the walls. And that could serve both the upstairs area as well as the downstairs area as well. So it seemed positive. He says there's also systems called, hang on, I had a note on it. Lunis air exchangers, which are essentially just in-wall units that have the heat recovery part built into them. And so you can just punch through a wall, have it come in and have it exchange that way. And maybe you'd have one on one side and one on the other side to have air transfer. But that cold air coming in is going to have a little bit of heat captured from the air that's in the room. So that could be another possibility. In terms of the heating system, he felt that mini split air conditioning and heating heat pumps would be the best solution. They're the most cost effective versus replacing the oil furnace that's down there with something else like an air to air or a water to air. Or a air to water, maybe that was it, which is recommended in the MERP report. He felt that the mini splits just get you more for less money and much better return. And we identified a couple of wall areas where you could put mini splits that could serve maybe 2 in the upstairs space that could serve that whole open area, both front and back of the building, and then maybe 1 downstairs in the children's area that could serve that whole space as well. But he also suggested, because of the age of the furnace, that you might want to replace that, and maybe it's with a high efficiency propane one. You're then able to remove the oil tank from the storage room, creating more space because storage is at an all-time high, or there isn't available in that building. And so by removing that oil tank, you reclaim that space, and then you're able to site a propane tank outside and be able to have a better and more efficient furnace, just because of the age of that. He said he wouldn't recommend changing it if it was a newer furnace, but because of the age, he says, you could replace that and feel good about that and move to a new fuel, even though it's not maybe ideal to what we wanted to do in terms of more electric base, but at least it gets you some of that way. So that was the gist of the meeting. So it seems like the things recommended in the MERP report are possible. It's sort of what we want to tackle and what the costs might be.
And what the MERP funding will provide.
Right, exactly.
Well, I noticed the payout period for the mini splits was quicker.
Yeah.
I think, what was it, 9 years versus 29, something like that.
Yeah. Those others were pretty high. And I I just can't imagine us going in that direction with a payout of 30 years for that. I think the mini splits make sense. It gives you, you'd still be using your oil or possibly propane fired furnace for your in-floor heating, both upstairs and downstairs. The mini splits would give you a little bit more heat, additional heat in the wintertime, but would provide fantastic cooling of the space and conditioning of the space during the summer, which is one of the big things. You wouldn't have to put air conditioners in the windows. And all of this is sort of on top, looking at what's needed in terms of buttoning up. You know, that was the first thing in terms of, getting it insulated, getting it tighter, as tight as you possibly can. So, yeah.
We just put a heat exchange system in my church up in Brunswick, in South Burlington, and part of that was health, the COVID.
Yeah.
To get air exchanges in the building, which
Yeah.
I would.
I think David has a question.
Oh, sorry, Richard. Sorry.
No.
I had a question, Ian, about the Dave Whitkin's, I guess, recommendation on those mini splits. When it occurred to me when I was reading these various reports that that the current heating system doesn't, when it gets very cold, I think it was I saw a number like below 15 degrees Fahrenheit, that it doesn't keep up with the heating demand. But these mini splits, their efficiency goes way down when it gets really cold. And I'm wondering, like, using that as the system that's gonna, sort of like augment it sounds like the main system will still be the boiler with the propane boiler at this. So did he talk about that at all?
No, not specifically, but it is something where we need to address. He could see that with the insulation that's in the floor, or the ceiling rather, that's downstairs, you could definitely improve the efficiency of the already existing in-floor heating. At the moment, it's just sort of insulated padding that's there, and you can get, I think recommended in the MERP report, is sort of metal brackets that wrap around the PEX tubing there, and then you do your insulation. So we're sort of losing, it's not as efficient as it could be, so we're losing a lot of heat through that, which is maybe the reason why, in combination with the insulation in the building, it's not, the heating system isn't able to do what it needs to do in the dead of winter. I know that mini splits are getting more efficient as years go by, especially in colder weather. That's a question we'd have to ask and say, if we moved to, if all the grant funding was approved, can we move to a more efficient propane system? And would the mini splits be able to supplement and give us that extra heating that we might need in the coldest months of winter?
I would
There was
think.
just one other, oh, sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Just follow up on that. So there was some conversation about the in the MERP report, which I think you were referring to earlier, that it wasn't complete. Like, there's no energy conservation measures that are that have been spelled out on the building envelope, et cetera, and how to make this the current heating system actually perform better, or perform adequately for the heating load by lowering the heating load as opposed to adding more stuff. I'd be very curious what this MERP report is going to finally come out with. But the previous reports that were done in 2022 talked about various things like making the in-floor heating more efficient, et cetera, so that we're not losing a lot of heat, and it's heating the space as opposed to heating the floor space. So I'm wondering, like, are we making recommendations on HVAC systems before, or are we taking those and running with those before we actually know what the envelope improvements are gonna be?
Yes, I wasn't sure. The reason I asked for Merck because I was sort of unsure why these meetings were scheduled now versus waiting for that report. But I think it's just sort of to get an idea of what of a direction we might want to move in, and especially in terms of the technology. And I think that's Frida's been scheduling these, I believe, just so she can get ahead in terms of the grant writing part of this. We've applied for a grant for the library. But I think because it was sort of a quick return or a quick working on that, we may not get it, but then there are other pools of money that we might be able to get. And I think by the time we need to sort of start discussing in detail what we might want to do as a town with that particular building, hopefully we'll have the MERP reports done and we can look and see what's needed. I do think, Dave's first thing that he said outside of the newer technology that we might put in for energy resilience is buttoning up the building and making it as tight as possible. And Matt's previous report, the one that you talked about, details a lot of that information, including infrared scans and photos and things like that. I was just looking at that in the last couple of days before this meeting. So there's a lot that can be done. I mean, it does detail that a lot has been done over the years, but it seems like there's still a bunch we can do that would improve the efficiency of the already existing heating system, and then anything we add will bring it to a place where we want it to be.
Yeah.
They use the term hybrid, I think, I think makes sense.
Yeah.
Sally?
Yeah, along these lines, as I recall, when we were first looking at the library, the main complaint was the upstairs was really cold and the downstairs was fine. So I think we should remember that's really what we want to do, is just get some more heat in the upstairs, whether that's doing something with the windows, because we're losing a lot through the windows.
Yeah.
And we don't have what we would need for the floor to be heated as well against the upstairs floor. We need to make that connection better, so then the heat is actually going there instead of staying in downstairs. So some of those basic things that we figured out, we should really remember those things.
Yeah, and Matt's report and this new one will hopefully give us a lot of detail on that. And the town isn't interested in trying to redevelop every single system that's there. I think we want to improve what we have there and then look and see what makes the most sense in terms of the building, in terms of longevity, and comfort for everyone that uses the space, both working there and people who come in.
Yeah.
All right, last call, questions, comments on that? All right. Thank you, everyone. Longer than usual meeting, but a lot of good stuff. A lot of good information coming out.
Hey, I just wanted to check in with everyone here about, well, like Ben, you are typing all the time. You didn't get to ask questions. Do you have any questions or comments or anything about the thermal energy networks? Because you're kind of skilled in that area, as I recall.
Oh, I don't know about that. No,
Okay.
I'm kidding. I mean, I thought it was really informative and useful. I think I always jump, my engineer brain always jumps to like the practical, like, okay, where would we drill the thermal well? And I can't figure out the location. That's the thing in my head that just like, I love the idea. And I think Jim's great points about infrastructure and how to like make it all fit and to do it and time it right so that we're not running into all these other regulatory roadblocks.
Mhm.
These are so, and I guess ultimately what I'm saying is that nothing was said that I wasn't already thinking, or like I didn't have anything unique or groundbreaking to bring up. I think it's just a practical application of actually doing it that I can't quite get yet. I can't get there yet, but we're not there yet. We need to even see, I think this group in general probably thinks it's a cool idea and we should explore it further. And we're not at the point where all the questions I did have, like, oh, how do you size the pipe and who designs the system and who do you put a 54-inch pipe in, knowing that you're going to connect to potentially 75 houses in 10 years? Like all that sort of stuff is what's flying around in my brain,
Yeah.
and we're not there yet. So I think I guess also I would say my time was best served typing everything out. So I got
Yeah,
a lot of great
definitely.
notes here. So
That's great. I imagine that if you and Jared sat down, you could have quite a good conversation about that stuff, because
Yeah.
he's a pipe man too, you know, he's been doing this stuff for a long time through
Yeah.
all his different work.
I think if we get to that point, we have a lot of good knowledge on this in this group, not just with me, that we could really
Yeah.
get into the weeds on it for sure. But again, I don't think we're quite there yet.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Great, thanks. I was glad to hear a little bit from you.
And many thanks, Ben, for doing the notes. Doing a great job on the notes.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
really. Thanks for making it all happen, Carl, with being at the office and
Oh, no worries. It's not, I didn't have Richard here to help me with the techno stuff.
I
Yeah,
know.
that's why it came off without a hitch.
No, I got here at 6:30 to make sure that everything,
Oh,
all the
boy.
ducks are in a row.
That's great. Thanks.
All right, thanks,
All right.
everybody.
Thanks, everyone, for being here. Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah,
great.
So,
Nice.
see you in a month.
All right, excellent. Bye.
It's always that awkward pause.